No funeral, big Hollywood service, lines of black cars, or public place for everyone to say goodbye to the king of late-night TV when he died. In the quiet that followed, though, one name kept coming back. It was a guest's name that no one saw coming. An old memory that he tried to forget. The person in question was? What was the point of telling that story in the last few months of Johnny Carson's life? American's bedside story for 30 years ended on January 23, 2005. John Carson, who was the undisputed king of late night, died peacefully at Los Angeles' Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. Officially, he died of lung failure caused by the emphysema he had been fighting. He had been alive for 79 years. His nephew, Jeff Sotz, put out a clear and strong message. His family was with him, and their loss will be unbearable. There is no service to remember them. The choice was shocking, but it was typical of them. Johnny Carson was very private for someone who was always in the spotlight and performed every night for millions of people. Dick Cavett, Carson's friend and fellow show, once talked about how awkward Carson was around other people and how hard it was for him to make small talk with a few fans outside the studio. Ed McMahon, who worked with him for 30 years and was his loyal assistant, reportedly said, "Johnny was comfortable in front of 20 million people and completely uncomfortable in front of 20. He was known as the most private public figure who ever lived. After he died, he finally had the peace he constantly wanted. After he died, his ashes were given to his wife, Alexis Moss. His famous friends and co-workers would not be able to get together with other people or share stories. An amazing 50 million people watched the man's last show, but only a few people were there to see it. The world mourned in the ways that were available to them. There were tributes from the top levels of government. John F. Kennedy called him a steady and comforting presence. The man who took over The Tonight Show after him, Jay Leno, called him the gold standard. People who knew Carson well said that David Letterman was his true heir. He said, "All of us who came after are pretenders. We will not see the likes of him again." Fans left flowers and notes on his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame and at Johnny Carson Park, which is across the street from the NBC studios where he had worked for so long. But there was no funeral. So how could someone come? And he had thousands of friends and a few strong foes, whose name being whispered after his death would have really shocked everyone. That person's absence for a long time is what matters, not who was there. It wasn't someone who showed up that day who was the surprise guest. Both of their lives would be shaped by the ghost of a friendship that was so strong and a betrayal that was so painful. Johnny Carson could never forgive that person. Going back to the beginning is necessary to understand the end. You may not know Joan Rivers as the famous performer she is now. She worked in seedy clubs in New York's Greenwich Village for years by the early 1960s, passing a hat that sometimes didn't even come back. She had camped out in her car, worked temp jobs to make money, and was even kicked off the Jack Bar version of The Tonight Show after just one show. She tried out 7 times for Johnny Carson's Tonight Show, but failed each time. In 1965, when she was only 31, many people in the business told her that her career was over. At that point came the night of February 17, 1965. Because he also worked for Bill Cosby, her boss set up the booking out of kindness. Rivers was sure it was her last chance when she walked out on stage. But a really cool thing happened. It was one of those nights when everything works out perfectly, and the audience and I just clicked. She wasn't funny. She was electric, and the most important person saw it. When her show was over, she sat down on the couch next to the host, and Johnny Carson said the words that would change her life forever. That night, he told her on national TV, "You're going to be a star." Rivers remembered looking behind her to see who he might be talking to. She said that the chemistry between them on TV was magical. At that moment, they became connected. Carson definitely didn't ignore her. He helped her and became her champion. She would say, "He gave me my career for years to come." Following that night, Joan Rivers would often appear on The Tonight Show. In the next 20 years, she showed up at almost 100 events. The way they talked on air was famous. He was the king who never lost his cool, and she was the court clown who was smart and funny and could make him laugh so hard he cried. There was truth to his faith in her. Rivers had her own daytime talk show for a short time in 1968, but Johnny Carson was her first famous guest, which was a huge show of support. There was more and more of her on the show. In the beginning, she filled in as host when Carson was away on vacation. By 1983, She was officially named the show's regular guest host. In this job, there was a lot of trust. The kingdom's keys were hers while Johnny was away. People in the business saw her as the queen-to-be. Her love for Carson was unwavering. Later, she said that over the years, she had turned down many offers to host her own show because she wanted to stay with The Tonight Show. But this one thing changes everything. Even though they were friendly on air, their friendship was mostly business. In front of the cameras and under the hot studio lights, it was there. The actress wrote, "Our friendship existed entirely on camera in front of America. And even then, during the commercial breaks, when the red light went off, we had nothing to say to each other. This wasn't because they disliked each other. It was because of Carson's legendary aloofness. He was a man who built walls around himself. There wasn't a relationship of close friends who confided in each other. It was a professional hierarchy. He was the king, the benefactor who had discovered her and given her a place in his court. And that unspoken power dynamic is the key to understanding the brutal betrayal that was to come." By the mid-1980s, the ground beneath Joan Rivers' feet began to feel unsteady. For years, she had felt secure in her role as Carson's number two. But things started to change. In 1985, Carson signed a new 2-year contract with NBC. Rivers, however, was only offered a 1-year deal. To her, the message was clear. She wrote, "It could only mean one thing. The powers were uncertain about my future." Then came the bigger blow. A memo began circulating at NBC listing the names of comedians being considered as possible permanent replacements for Johnny when he eventually decided to retire. Rivers, who had logged more hours in that chair than anyone besides Johnny himself, assumed her name would be at the top of the list. But when she saw it, she was gutted. Her name wasn't on it at all. She came to a painful conclusion. NBC would never give the host's spot to a woman. She felt her role as guest host was a safe way for the network to use her talent without ever seeing her as a true competitor or successor to the king. It was at this exact moment of vulnerability that a new player entered the game. A fledgling network called Fox was preparing to launch, and its executives, including Barry Diller, wanted to make a huge splash. They approached Joan Rivers with an offer that was impossible to ignore. Her own late-night talk show, The Late Show, starring Joan Rivers. The show would air in the exact same time slot directly opposite The Tonight Show, and the salary was a staggering $10 million, many times what she was making at NBC. Rivers was faced with an agonizing decision. Her loyalty was to Johnny, the man who had made her, but she felt disrespected and discarded by the network he worked for. Her husband and manager, Edgar Rosenberg, gave her some critical advice. He told her not to say a word to Carson until the contract with Fox was signed and finalized. His reasoning was based on cold, hard Hollywood logic. Other comedians who had been regulars on The Tonight Show and left to start competing shows were often immediately banned from appearing on Carson's program. If she told Johnny, and then the Fox deal fell through for some reason, she could be left with nothing. Even worse, they both feared that the famously powerful Carson could make one quiet phone call and kill her deal before it ever happened. So, she kept silent, a decision she would come to regret for the rest of her life. The weekend before the official announcement, the news leaked. What happened next depends entirely on who you believe, as two completely different versions of the story emerged. According to Joan Rivers, she was horrified that he heard it from someone else. She immediately tried to call him to explain. She said she finally got him on the phone and told him she was leaving to host her own show on Fox. He said nothing. He just hung up. She called back thinking they must have been disconnected. He hung up on her a second time. That was it. They would never speak again. Johnny Carson's version was starkly different. He claimed that phone call never happened. He told people that he learned about her new show from a press release just like the rest of the world. He felt completely blindsided, ambushed, and betrayed by the person he had championed for over 20 years. Why was his reaction so extreme? Other male comedians had left to do their own shows, and while there might have been tension, Carson had often given them his blessing. Rivers had her own theory, one that cut much deeper than simple professional competition. She later wrote, "I think he really felt because I was a woman that I just was his, that I wouldn't leave him. I think it was a case of, I found you, you're mine. He didn't like that about you as a woman." When I went up against him, Carson thought that a guy leaving to compete was a sign of ambition. For a woman to leave was treason. Someone disobeyed the king, so he would be very angry and hurt very badly. Johnny Carson, who was the most powerful person on TV, did everything he could to punish her. As a first and most clear result, she was banned from The Tonight Show right away, and for good. Carson didn't let her back into the studio that had become her second home for the rest of his time there, and for years after he left. That wasn't all that happened, though. Carson made a list of people who were basically banned. People who were guests on Joan Rivers's Late Show were told they could no longer be on The Tonight Show. The decision was easy for famous people and their managers. You could be on the upstart network's news show that isn't doing well, or you could be on the most important and powerful show in TV history. A lot of people picked Carson. Rivers basically couldn't get any A-list guests. An NBC executive who was a personal friend of hers is said to have told her straight out, "We are going to destroy you." The Late Show started on October 9th, 1986, and had problems almost right away. Without big-name guests and having to deal with Carson's huge audience numbers, the show had a hard time behind the scenes. Worse things happened. Edgar Rivers, Rivers' husband and a producer on the show, would often fight with Fox bosses. The network told Joan she had to make a choice after less than a year. Notify her husband. No, she said. Therefore, Fox fired them both in May 1987. The professional embarrassment was terrible, but a terrible personal tragedy was about to happen right next to it. The public fallout, the huge bills they had racked up, and the failure of the show put too much stress on her marriage to bear. When they were fired 3 months later, Edgar Rosenberg killed himself. Joan Rivers was all by herself when things were worst in her life. It was the end of her career. His wife was no longer with him. He had been her biggest supporter before, but he was silent the whole time. No call from Johnny Carson. I never got a note from him. He never said anything to show sympathy. The fight went from being a nasty Hollywood fight to a really dark and sad story because of this one action or lack of action. It showed Carson in a way that his fans had never seen him. A man who was so angry that he had no sense of humanity or common sense. Rivers would later say that she felt completely cut off from the world she used to rule. Feeling like Stalin sent me to Siberia. The king had finished his punishment, and it was final. Let's go back to that normal January 2005 day. When people heard that Johnny Carson had died, one of the first things that came to mind was his long-running feud with Joan Rivers. She was his legacy's ghost, the one loose and that the master of control could never tie up. Her story was the tribute he never got because there wasn't a real funeral. She was the surprise visitor. Their past made her response to his death as complicated and raw as it was. There was no easy way to show sadness. Instead, her public statements showed a complicated mix of long-lasting anger, deep hurt, and a surprising amount of respect for the job. In an interview, she was completely honest and called him a mean son of a. But then she would say that he was the smartest straight man ever. He is not touched. The pain was still new, even though it had been almost 20 years since he had spoken. Even though she didn't say she felt bad about taking the Fox show, she did say she missed the chance to be gracious that Carson had missed. In an interview she gave right before she died, she talked about how she thought their story should end differently. She told Johnny what he should have done. After everything, after I quit the show, after I was fired from Fox, and after Edgar killed himself, Johnny should have brought me back on the show and asked me, "Where have you been?" It would have made all the newspapers, and we should have picked right up. It would have been a moment of forgiveness, a classy move from the classiest man on television. But it never happened. Even years after his death, Rivers was still searching for some kind of closure. On an episode of her reality show, Joan and Melissa, Joan Knows Best, she visited the cemetery where Carson's ashes were interred. The cameras followed as she tried to finally confront the man who had shut her out of his life, speaking to the empty air in a final, heartbreaking attempt to make peace. This is why Joan Rivers was the true guest at Johnny Carson's funeral. While he had retreated into his intensely private world after retiring in 1992, never speaking publicly about the feud, she had been forced to live with the consequences out in the open. For years, she was the sole historian of their broken friendship, telling her side of the story in interviews and on stage because his side was only silence. At the moment of his death, her voice and her pain were the loudest echoes of his past. The unexpected guest wasn't a person standing in a church. It was the unavoidable, tragic, and unforgettable memory of the one person he built up and the one person he could never forgive. In the end, Johnny Carson got the quiet exit he always wanted. There was no public spectacle, no grand memorial, but that silence was filled by the story of the one person he could never forgive. The most unexpected guest at the end of his life wasn't a person at all, but a memory. The memory of a friendship he created with a single sentence and destroyed with the click of a telephone. It was a final silent testament to the absolute loyalty he demanded and the unforgivable price of betrayal in the court of the king of late night.